They used to say Elias could turn dust into gold. He wasn't born rich, no, not even close. The son of an ordinary craftsman and a mother who sold fruits under the sun. But from a young age, Elias had something most people didn't, a hunger that refused to sleep. He wasn't just chasing money, he was chasing control, the power to decide who he'd become and who he'd never have to bow to again. He started small, one rented shop, one borrowed idea, and one promise whispered to himself every night: I will never go back to nothing. Years passed, and Elias became the name everyone wanted to know and to fear. He built an empire out of silence and strategy, brick by brick, deal by deal. He was ruthless when he had to be, charming when it was useful. He didn't smile often, but when he did, it usually meant someone else was losing. The city worshipped him. His face was on magazine covers, his words quoted in newspapers. He was the man people pointed at and said, that's what success looks like. But success is a fragile thing. It can sit quietly in your hand for years, then disappear like smoke. Elias's empire had grown too fast, too far. He couldn't see it from his office window, but cracks were spreading beneath the surface, the kind of cracks you only notice when the floor starts sinking. It began with whispers, strange inconsistencies in his company's books, a deal that didn't go through, partners who stopped returning calls. Then, one morning, his accountant came in trembling, holding a file that would shatter everything. Sir, there's a problem, a very big problem. Elias took the file and flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who could smell fear, and the accountant reeked of it. What do you mean, problem? He asked quietly. The man hesitated. Funds, sir. Missing. A lot of them. It was a betrayal from the people he trusted most. His closest partners had been bleeding his accounts dry for years, hiding the evidence under the noise of his growing success. When the storm hit, it didn't come gently. First came the audits, then the investigations, then the headlines. Elias's empire under fire, fraud scandal rocks billionaire's business. In the beginning, he fought. He hired lawyers, gave interviews, even smiled for the cameras, pretending nothing was wrong. But as the weeks turned to months, his walls crumbled faster than he could rebuild them. Investors pulled out, accounts froze, and one by one, the people who used to say, yes, sir, stopped picking up his calls. There's a certain silence that only the powerful know, the kind that follows after applause stops. Elias found himself in that silence. He'd sit alone in his mansion, surrounded by luxury that now felt like mockery. His once busy phone became quiet, except for messages from lawyers and debt collectors. He stopped sleeping. Nights were long, haunted by questions that had no answers. How could he, of all people, lose it all? And then came the moment that finished him. A government raid. Officers swarming his company headquarters like vultures, cameras flashing as they carried out boxes of files. The image was everywhere, the once untouchable billionaire standing outside his own building, surrounded by chaos. Some said he looked calm, others said he looked broken, but those who really knew him knew the truth. Elias wasn't calm, he was numb. Within weeks, his properties were seized, his cars gone, his accounts frozen, his name ruined. He tried to hold on to dignity, but dignity doesn't feed you. It doesn't stop the whispers, the pity, the laughter. His friends disappeared first, then his business partners, then even his family distanced themselves, afraid of the shame that followed his name like a shadow. Elias, the man who once commanded boardrooms with a look, was now invisible. There's something about losing everything that changes the sound of your heartbeat. It doesn't beat for success anymore. It beats just to survive. He started selling things. First, the smaller luxuries, the watches, the suits, the jewelry, then the cars, then the house itself. People whispered about him in the streets. Some said he deserved it. Others said he'd rise again. But Elias didn't listen to either. He was too tired. When the auctioneer's hammer fell on the last of his possessions, he didn't even watch. He just walked away, wearing a simple shirt and holding a small bag, everything he now owned in the world. You can say that's the day Elias truly died. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The billionaire was gone. What remained was just a man. He wandered for days, sleeping where he could, eating when he found something. At first, he thought it was temporary, that someone would call, some miracle would come. But no one did. And as the sun rose each morning, Elias began to fade into the crowd. Another forgotten man, another stranger on the streets. One evening, he sat under a broken streetlight, watching people walk past him like he didn't exist. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His body ached. His pride screamed louder than his hunger. But even pride gets tired. He looked at the last thing he owned, a gold wristwatch, the symbol of who he used to be. For a long time, he just stared at it, the reflection of the dying light bouncing off its face. Then, slowly, he took it off and placed it beside him. "What good are you now?" he whispered. "You can't feed me." A young boy walking past noticed the watch and stopped. "Uncle, are you selling it?" Elias looked up. The boy's eyes were innocent, curious, not judgmental. He nodded. "How much?" the boy asked. He smiled faintly, a bitter smile. "Whatever you can afford." The boy hesitated, then pulled a few crumpled notes from his pocket and handed them to him. He took them gently, his hands trembling. When the boy left, Elias stared at the money, then looked up at the sky. He whispered, "So this is what I've become." And in that moment, it wasn't just about losing wealth. It was about losing the illusion that he was untouchable. That night, as he lay on the sidewalk, something inside him cracked open. He thought of all the people he had ignored, all the beggars he had brushed past without a glance. He remembered once telling a driver, "Don't stop for them. They made their choices." Now, he understood. No one chooses pain. It simply arrives, quiet, cruel, and patient. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, Elias prayed. Not for money, not for revenge, just for strength to wake up tomorrow. When morning came, he did wake up, hungry, weak, but alive. And that's when he saw her, an old woman seated by the roadside, holding a tin cup. Her eyes were kind. She looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "You look hungry, my son." He hesitated, pride fighting reality. "I'm fine," he murmured. She chuckled, a gentle, broken laugh. "Fine people don't sit on the ground like me." He didn't answer. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a half piece of bread. "Here," she said, "eat. You'll need strength for whatever tomorrow brings." He stared at the bread, then at her. "Why are you giving me this?" She smiled faintly. "Because someone once gave me." He took it, and as he ate in silence, a single tear rolled down his cheek, not because of pity, but because for the first time in his life, he realized what kindness without expectation felt like. That was the day Elias began to learn, not business, not power, but survival, the kind that humbles, strips, and rebuilds a man from inside out. And though he didn't know it then, That old woman, Mama Ruth, would become his greatest teacher. Once, Elias owned skyscrapers. Now he slept under them. Once, his name opened doors. Now, it didn't even earn him a glance. But in losing everything, something new was beginning to take shape. Something no wealth could buy. Because sometimes it takes falling into the dust to finally see the ground you've been walking on. Elias woke to the sound of city life continuing without him. Horns honked, street vendors shouted, children ran barefoot through puddles, and the smell of fried plantain mingled with exhaust. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was temporary, that someone would call, someone would rescue him. But no one came. The city that had once bent to his will now barely noticed his presence. He had no money, no home, no status, nothing but the clothes on his back and the aching pride that refused to let him beg. Yet each day the pangs of hunger forced him closer to a reality he had long ignored. The streets were alive with life that he had never seen when he was at the top. Beggars huddled in corners, their hands outstretched, their eyes weary yet hopeful. Children scavenged through trash, laughing and crying in equal measure. He watched them from the shadows, feeling a sting in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky a dusty orange, Elias found a small alcove beneath a crumbling building to rest. That was when he met Mama Ruth. She was small and fragile, her frame bent with age and years of hardship, yet her eyes held a fierce warmth that seemed to peer right through him. She was counting a few coins she had collected that day, humming softly under her breath. "You look lost, my son," she said without looking up. Her voice carried authority, but also kindness. Elias was taken aback. Most people on the street ignored him, even in this state of destitution. I am," he admitted finally. His pride protested, but hunger and exhaustion outweighed it. Mama Ruth chuckled softly. "Most people who come here think they are just passing through, but the street, it has a way of keeping you if you let it." She looked at him carefully. "You need to eat." He hesitated. His pride was still alive, burning quietly. "I don't need charity," he said. She finally met his gaze. "No one asks for charity here, my son. We ask for survival." There was a lesson in her eyes, one that he couldn't fully grasp yet. He nodded slowly and accepted the small loaf of bread she offered. The taste was humble, but it felt like manna to a man who had feasted on the finest foods for decades. He had never been so aware of flavor, of necessity, of gratitude. Over the next few days, he returned to the same corner, watching Mama Ruth navigate the streets with grace and authority. She was a queen in a kingdom that no one recognized. She knew every beggar, every passerby, every hidden alley where food or opportunity could be found. Elias followed her lead, learning how to ask for work, how to find scraps without humiliation, how to survive the indifference of those around him. Each day chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. The arrogance that had fueled his rise as a billionaire now felt empty and cruel. He began to see the world differently, not as a place to dominate, but as a web of human struggles, each one deserving respect. He saw mothers crying quietly in alleys, young boys stealing not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice, and men who pretended to be strong yet shook with cold and fear each night. Elias began to interact slowly with the people he had once ignored. At first, it was simple, asking for directions, sharing scraps, offering to carry a bundle for someone. But as he spent more time, he started to listen. Each person had a story, a struggle, a pain that mirrored and yet differed from his own. There was a beggar named Daniel who had once been a driver for a wealthy family, now broken by debt and misfortune. There was a girl, barely 15, who sang on street corners to feed her younger siblings. Each encounter was a mirror, reflecting pieces of himself he had refused to see in the mirror of his luxurious past. One rainy afternoon, he helped a man whose feet were cut and bleeding, his sandals useless in the mud. As he pressed strips of cloth to the wounds, the man looked up at him and smiled faintly. "You don't have to do this, brother." "I know," Elias replied quietly, "but I can." It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, yet it sent a warmth through him that money had never given him. It was here, in these small acts of compassion, that he began to understand the depth of wealth beyond currency. Human connection, dignity, the simple gift of noticing someone. Mama Ruth watched him, her eyes softening. "You are learning, Elias. The street doesn't forgive laziness or arrogance, but it does teach those willing to listen." He nodded, swallowing pride he didn't realize was still lodged in his throat. And slowly, he began to listen, not just to Mama Ruth, but to the city, to the people, to the stories around him. The days blurred into weeks. Elias learned to sleep in the hidden alcoves of buildings, to find meals in unexpected places, to navigate the streets with caution and care. Yet, in the quiet moments, when he was alone with the cold and the ache of hunger, he reflected on the life he had lost, the empire, the parties, the people who had fawned over him. None of it mattered now. What mattered was this: survival, humility, and understanding a world he had never truly seen. One morning, he woke to find Mama Ruth coughing violently. Her small frame shook, and he rushed to her side. "Mama, what is it?" "Just old age catching up," she whispered. "I'll be fine." But her face betrayed her pain. Elias felt an unfamiliar panic. This woman, who had been his guide, his teacher in the ways of this hidden world, needed him. He ran through the streets, seeking medicine, coins, anything to help her. For the first time, he experienced fear, not for himself, but for another person. And when he finally returned with what little he could gather, Mama Ruth looked at him and smiled weakly. "You are not the man you were, Elias. You are better." He didn't respond, only helped her rest, feeling the weight of his own vulnerability. It was in these moments, in the shared struggle and care, that he began to feel something he had long ignored: empathy, a real, tangible understanding of another human being's suffering. Through the weeks, he noticed the patterns of the streets, the rhythms of survival, the alliances and conflicts among beggars, the quiet acts of generosity that went unnoticed by the wealthier world. He began keeping track of resources, learning where food could be found, which streets were safer, which opportunities might arise for those willing to work quietly. He wasn't planning to rebuild his empire, not yet. He was building something more subtle: knowledge. Knowledge of life as it truly was, not filtered through wealth or status. One evening, as he shared a small meal with a group of beggars he had come to know, one of them, a woman named Grace, turned to him. "You've changed, Elias. You used to look at us like we were nothing. Now?" She paused. "Now you see us." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I see you," he said simply. It was more than words. It was truth. For the first time in his life, he felt like part of something larger than himself. And yet, beneath the gratitude and newfound humility, a seed of restlessness remained. He wondered how he could take what he had learned from the streets and use it to create something meaningful. Perhaps, he thought, his journey was not just survival, but preparation. Preparation for a return, not to the arrogance of wealth, but to the strength of understanding, compassion, and purpose. Nights were the hardest. Lying beneath the stars, or what passed for stars amidst city lights, he remembered the life he had lost. He mourned it, not for the material, but for the illusion of control it had given him. And in that mourning, he realized that losing everything had gifted him something priceless: clarity. Through it all, Mama Ruth remained a steady presence, guiding him with quiet wisdom. Remember, Elias, the streets do not define you. They reveal you, and what they reveal is worth more than gold. He listened, absorbing the words as if they were a lifeline. Slowly, day by day, he shed the last vestiges of arrogance and pride. The billionaire within him had died, but something gentler, more resilient, and infinitely wiser was taking shape. He began to help others, in small ways at first, sharing food, offering a warm word, protecting those weaker than himself. He saw the impact of these gestures ripple outward: a smile, a nod, a simple hand offered. It was wealth of a different sort, and in that wealth, Elias discovered purpose. By the time weeks had passed, the city no longer felt hostile or indifferent. It felt alive, full of stories, full of lessons, and Elias was learning them all, one encounter at a time. He understood that the street was harsh, unrelenting, but honest. Here, he could not hide behind money, status, or charm. Here, he was simply a man, and that was both terrifying and liberating. Through this life on the streets, Elias began to transform. The lessons were harsh, but each one was a stepping stone towards something greater. He realized that wealth without understanding is empty, power without empathy is hollow, and though he had nothing, he had begun to possess something far more valuable: insight, humility, and the first stirrings of true purpose. The weeks rolled by, and the streets became Elias's new classroom. Every encounter, every glance, every whispered conversation taught him lessons that no boardroom ever could. He saw the quiet suffering of people who had no choice but to endure, and in their faces he saw a reflection of what he might have become if fortune had never smiled on him. Survival was a teacher unlike any other. It demanded patience, humility, and an awareness that no man can truly thrive alone. Mama Ruth continued to guide him, her presence both steady and fierce. She had an uncanny way of knowing when Elias faltered, when pride tried to creep back into his thoughts. "Strength isn't about fighting for yourself, Elias," she said one damp morning, her voice gravelly but warm. "It's about helping someone fight for themselves, even when you have nothing to give." Elias listened, but understanding was a slow process. At first, he helped with small things: carrying water, sharing meals, guiding someone to a safer corner for the night. Each act was deliberate, careful, and yet his heart was heavy. Pride and shame rustled within him. He had once commanded thousands. Now he could barely command respect from those he wished to help. One afternoon, he met a boy no older than 12, sitting beside a pile of old rags and muttering to himself. The boy's eyes were wide with fear and determination, and his hands were raw from picking through trash. Elias knelt beside him. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Jide," the boy replied, wary but curious. "Do you want something to eat?" Elias offered. The boy hesitated, scanning him as though trying to decide if this stranger would harm him. When Elias held out a small piece of bread, Jaide's face lit up with a mixture of relief and wonder. He accepted it, nibbling slowly. "You shouldn't be on the streets alone," Elias said gently. "Where are your parents?" "They left. Said I'd be fine. I'm fine." Elias didn't argue. Instead, he sat beside him, silent, letting the boy eat. In that silence, he realized something profound. Survival on the streets wasn't just physical, it was a constant negotiation with fear, with loss, with hope that no one promised you. That evening, as they parted ways, Elias felt an unfamiliar ache. It was compassion, raw and insistent, but also a quiet awakening. He began seeking out the people like Jaide, those who were invisible to the world, but who carried stories heavy enough to bend shoulders far older than theirs. Each interaction left him exhausted, yet he felt richer in a way he had never imagined. Mama Ruth noticed the change. "You are becoming one of us, Elias," she said one evening as they sat under the dim glow of a streetlight. "Not a beggar, not a billionaire. You are learning to see people for what they are, and that is a rare kind of wealth." The words sunk in slowly. For decades, Elias had measured life in numbers, in deals, in status. Now he measured it differently, in smiles, in tears, in moments of genuine connection. He began to understand that empathy could be cultivated, that noticing another's pain and responding was a form of currency far more valuable than any banknote he had once held. One particularly harsh morning, Mama Ruth fell ill. Her small body shook with fever, and she could barely manage to walk to the food lines. Elias panicked. For the first time, he realized that he was responsible for someone else's survival in a way that mattered. He ran through the streets, gathering coins, pleading for medicine, and bargaining for food with street vendors. Each step was a lesson in humility, how to ask without shame, how to negotiate without aggression, how to find hope in desperation. When he returned to Mama Ruth with a small parcel of medicine and food, she looked at him with tired, knowing eyes. She said, "You are learning faster than I expected," she coughed lightly. "Remember, Elias, a person's true strength is revealed in how they care for others when there is nothing left to give." Elias nodded, a lump in his throat. He realized then that the streets were not cruel by accident. They were precise teachers. They stripped away vanity, arrogance, and pride, leaving only the essence of a person. And in that essence, he discovered a resilience that no amount of wealth could create. Days blurred into nights, and Elias's understanding deepened. He began noticing the small acts of kindness that passed unnoticed by the world. A woman sharing her soup with a cold child. A man offering his only blanket to another who shivered beside him. A stranger holding a hand steady for someone who had lost their footing. Each moment was a lesson. Each gesture, a story that wove together the fragile yet unbreakable fabric of human dignity. Elias started documenting these acts in his mind, remembering faces, stories, and details. He saw patterns, the ways people survived, adapted, and sometimes thrived despite everything against them. And slowly he began applying these observations to himself, to how he moved through the streets, how he interacted with others, how he made choices that were not about survival alone, but about creating ripples of goodness. One evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights flickered on, Elias sat beside a small fire, warming his hands and reflecting. He thought of the empire he had lost, the fortune that had vanished, the friends who had abandoned him. And he understood, with a clarity that frightened and humbled him, that all of that had been a test in disguise. He had been wealthy, yes, but blind. Blind to human struggle, blind to true connection, blind to the invisible world that existed right under his nose. It was Grace, a young volunteer who brought water and blankets to the street at regular intervals, who finally voiced what Elias was beginning to realize. "You're not like the others," she said softly one afternoon. "You see us. You care. You understand." He looked at her, unsure if he should admit the truth. I I didn't before," he said quietly. "I couldn't. I had everything. I thought I needed nothing else." She smiled faintly, as if she had expected this answer. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. Her words struck him like a revelation, and in that revelation, a seed of purpose took root, a purpose that had nothing to do with wealth, power, or status, and everything to do with human dignity, empathy, and transformation. The weeks that followed were a series of small victories. Elias learned to negotiate with street vendors not just for food, but for respect. He mediated disputes among those he had once overlooked, using insight and calm rather than money to influence outcomes. He saw the city through the eyes of those who lived on its margins, and in doing so, he began to reconstruct his understanding of success. It was no longer measured by property or possessions, but by impact, by the quiet shifts in the lives of people around him. And yet, amidst all this learning, he carried a quiet question in his heart. What was next? He had survived, yes, and he had grown. But how could he take this knowledge, this empathy, this understanding, and transform it into something lasting? He didn't know the answer yet, but he trusted the process. He trusted the streets that had taught him so much, and he trusted Mama Ruth, who had quietly become his anchor in this turbulent new world. By the time the rainy season came, Elias was no longer the desperate man who had stumbled into the city weeks before. He moved with purpose, spoke with understanding, and acted with consideration. People noticed. Some whispered about the stranger who walked with humility, who helped without expectation, who seemed to understand the city's hidden truths. And though he had nothing but his clothes and his mind, he began to feel a sense of wealth he had never known, the wealth of connection, of knowledge, of unshakable resilience. One evening, as the rain fell in cold sheets and the city lights shimmered like distant stars, Elias sat beside Mama Ruth. She handed him a cup of warm tea, her hand shaking slightly. "Do you understand now, Elias?" He nodded. "I think I do. It's not money. It's everything else. It's how you see the world, how you care, how you act when there is nothing to gain." Mama Ruth smiled, her eyes glistening. "Exactly. And the people who learn this, they are the ones who will truly survive, even if the world takes everything else." Elias sipped the tea, warmth spreading through him in more ways than one. He thought of Jeed, of Daniel, of the countless faces he had met. Each had taught him something, and in return, he had offered what he could, small though it might have been. He realized then that the streets had done more than teach him survival. They had awakened him to humanity itself. And in that awakening, Elias glimpsed a horizon beyond mere existence, beyond survival, where his life could have purpose, impact, and meaning, where wealth was measured not by possessions, but by lives touched, dignity restored, and hope rekindled. For the first time in months, Elias slept without fear, without hunger consuming his thoughts. And though the future remained uncertain, one truth was clear. Elias was not the man he had been.
He had become something more, someone who could rise not by reclaiming wealth, but by rebuilding humanity itself, beginning with himself.
The city had a rhythm now that Elias understood. The chaos, the noise, the constant movement, it no longer intimidated him. It became a guide, showing him where to find small chances, subtle openings, moments where a kind word or a careful action could ripple outward. He moved with awareness, noticing not just where he was, but who he passed, who needed help, and who had something to teach him. One morning, he found himself at the edge of a small market, watching as traders shouted over the din of buyers, haggling over vegetables, grains, and handmade wares. He remembered a lesson Mama Ruth had taught him. Opportunities are everywhere, Elias, but most people walk past them because they're too proud to see them or too afraid to act. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. At first, it was simple, helping an elderly vendor lift a sack of yams, carrying a basket of tomatoes through the mud, giving directions to a lost customer. These small acts drew smiles, nods, and whispered thanks. For the first time, Elias realized that influence didn't require money. It required attention, care, and respect. A week later, he met a man named Segun, a street-side carpenter who repaired furniture for anyone who could pay, no matter how little. Segun had a sharp mind, a quick wit, and a generosity that mirrored Mama Ruth's own. Elias watched him work, fascinated by how much value one man could create with skill, patience, and integrity. "You've been watching," Segun said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. Elias nodded. "I'm learning," he admitted. Segun studied him for a long moment. Most people in your position, most people who've lost everything, will be bitter, angry, or desperate. But you see the work, not the loss. Elias didn't respond immediately. He thought of the empire he had lost, the deals gone wrong, the friends who had abandoned him. All of it mattered less now than he thought it would. What mattered was being present, being useful, being part of something that actually mattered. Segun offered him a chance, a small one, a low-paying job helping in the workshop. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't a return to the boardroom, but it was a beginning. Elias accepted, though humility and hesitation warred within him. For a man who commanded respect with a glance, the act of performing labor without expectation felt alien. Days turned into weeks in the workshop. Elias learned to measure, cut, sand, and assemble. His hands, once accustomed to signing contracts and shaking hands in executive offices, now bore blisters and cuts. And yet he relished it. There was a rhythm, a tangible result to his efforts, and the satisfaction it brought was unlike anything money had ever purchased. He observed Segun closely, noting the subtle ways he negotiated with suppliers, managed clients, and kept his business running smoothly. There were lessons here that books could never teach. Lessons of trust, humility, negotiation, and integrity. He absorbed them all like a sponge soaking up water after a long drought. One day, a client arrived at the workshop, a wealthy businessman seeking a custom-made cabinet. Segun was busy, and Elias stepped forward, offering to handle the order under Segun's supervision. The client, skeptical at first, watched as Elias measured, planned, and executed with surprising precision. When the work was completed, the client nodded in approval, impressed not just by the craftsmanship, but by Elias's professionalism. Segun clapped him on the shoulder. "See, Elias? Influence doesn't come from wealth. It comes from skill, reliability, and respect.
You've been given nothing, yet you are learning everything." Elias smiled, feeling a quiet pride, not the kind that demanded recognition, but the kind that satisfied the soul. He was learning that rebuilding didn't happen overnight, and that small victories often carried more weight than grand gestures. Through these small victories, Elias began to notice changes in himself. His temper, once quick and sharp, had softened. His arrogance had given way to patience. He found joy in helping others, not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. And as he walked through the streets each day, he realized that people were beginning to notice him differently, not as a fallen billionaire, not as a beggar, but as a man who had earned his place through effort, empathy, and integrity.
One afternoon, a young woman named Amaka approached him. She had heard of his work in the workshop and sought his help in designing furniture for a community center she was establishing. Elias hesitated, then agreed. The project wasn't about profit, it was about service. And as he worked with Amaka and her team, he felt something stir inside him. Purpose. For the first time since losing everything, he felt that his actions could shape the world in a positive way. Mama Ruth watched these developments with quiet approval. "You see, Elias," she said one evening, handing him a cup of tea, "the street doesn't just strip you down, it also builds you up. You've been given a second chance, not to regain what you lost, but to become someone greater than what you were." Elias reflected on her words. They resonated deeply. He understood now that true wealth wasn't measured by bank accounts or mansions, but by the ability to impact lives, to restore dignity, and to cultivate resilience in oneself and others. Weeks turned into months, and Elias's reputation began to shift. Word spread about the man who had fallen from wealth and yet found new meaning on the streets. People came seeking his counsel, not for money, but for guidance, for insight, for the wisdom that came from experiencing loss and survival firsthand. He began mentoring young men and women, showing them skills he had learned from Segun, teaching them patience, discipline, and empathy. He shared stories of his former life not as a cautionary tale, but as a framework for understanding ambition, pride, and the fragility of wealth. One evening, as he returned from the community center, he noticed a crowd gathered around a street performer. Children were laughing, parents smiling, and the energy was electric. He stepped closer, feeling a warmth he had known in years. A man in the crowd looked at him and said, "You're Elias, aren't you? The man who lost everything and came back?" Elias nodded slowly. "I am," he said, though he felt the truth was more complicated than that. He had lost much, yes, but he had gained more. Knowledge, empathy, purpose, a connection to the world he had never truly seen before. The man shook his head in awe. "Most people would have given up, but you changed. And somehow you make us believe we can too." Elias didn't respond. He only watched the children play, the street alive with life, and felt the stirrings of a vision forming in his mind. A vision not of wealth, not of empires, but of a world where people could rise from nothing, where dignity and opportunity could be shared, where the lessons of survival became tools for growth. Mama Ruth's words echoed in his mind. The street doesn't just strip you down, it builds you up. And in that moment, Elias understood he had been rebuilt. Not by money, not by power, but by humanity itself. He began planning quietly. Small steps at first. Workshops, mentorship programs, community projects. Each act was deliberate, grounded in the lessons he had learned from Segun, Mama Ruth, and the countless souls who had shared their lives with him on the streets. It wasn't about regaining his former status. It was about creating something lasting, something meaningful, something that would outlive him. And yet, despite this focus, a quiet fire remained. Not ambition for wealth, but ambition for impact. He wanted to see what could happen when someone who had fallen from the highest heights used that experience to lift others.
Could he rebuild a life richer than the one he had lost? Could he create an empire, not of money, but of human potential? The answer, he realized, would not come quickly. But he had learned patience. He had learned resilience. He had learned that every person he helped, every life he touched, was a brick in the foundation of a new legacy, one not built on vanity, but on understanding, compassion, and purpose. Night fell over the city, rain pattering softly against the rooftops. Elias stood beneath a street lamp, watching the shadows move, the people living their lives, the world continuing on. He breathed deeply, savoring the air, the sounds, the life around him. He was still a man who had lost everything, but he was also a man who had found himself, and in that discovery lay the true power to rise again.
Months had rolled by since Elias, a 30-year-old Nigerian man once drowning in wealth, first stepped into Segun's workshop. The streets no longer swallowed him with fear or shame. He moved through the alleys with a calm kind of power. Not money power, not intimidation, just that quiet respect people give someone who truly sees them. Folks didn't whisper about him as that billionaire who lost everything anymore. Now they spoke his name with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Elias had built a small circle of young Nigerians, boys and girls who had tasted survival in ways life shouldn't demand. He taught them hand skills, carpentry, tailoring, trading, but he also taught street wisdom, respect, patience, discipline, and the underrated art of generosity. But you know how cities be, especially ones that don't play. For every person who saw hope in Elias, there were others who felt threatened. One afternoon, a group that controlled certain market corners through intimidation pulled up on him. "You think you can come here and change things?" their leader said, chest out like he was auditioning for Villain of the Year. Elias didn't flinch. "I'm not changing the rules. I'm just showing there's another way to live." The men didn't expect calmness. They expected fear. The way Elias spoke, with a confidence that wasn't loud, but deeply rooted, made them pause. They backed off, but Elias knew beef like that never fully disappears. Still, he kept moving. Amaka's community center project was thriving, and Elias became one of the brains behind it. Together, they built programs that hit differently: skill workshops, small startup support, and youth mentoring. Elias saw kids who once begged, now earning income. He saw families building healthier routines. He watched lives shift in real time, and every win hit him deeper than any business success he ever had. But growth came with stress. Some nights he couldn't sleep, replaying worries about funding, safety, and the people relying on him. One evening, Mama Ruth, the older Nigerian woman who had become his moral compass, found him staring over the rooftops. "You carry too much, my son," she said. "I have to," he replied. "If I don't, who will?" She shook her head gently. "Strength isn't doing everything alone. Wisdom is knowing when to let others help." Her words found a home in him. As more people heard about his transformation, old faces from his past started reappearing. Some supportive, some judgmental, some just nosy. Elias didn't chase their approval anymore. He had learned to move with intention, not ego. One afternoon, walking through the market, he spotted a young Nigerian girl selling handmade trinkets, shaking as older boys tried to bullying her. Without hesitation, he stepped in. One look, one calm sentence: "Leave her alone." And the boys melted away, not because he scared them, but because he carried an authority born from experience. The girl whispered, "Thank you." In that moment, Elias understood the power of small acts. Not everything needed to be a grand gesture. Sometimes protecting one child was enough. His influence spread quietly. Market vendors who used to argue now handled disputes with more maturity. Youths who once slept under broken stalls now had paying work. The community center buzzed daily with activity. Amaka and Elias became an unstoppable duo,
vision and execution moving in perfect sync. Jide, now a 14-year-old Nigerian boy who had once survived by digging through trash, sat beside Elias one night and asked, "Do you miss your old life, the big man life?" Elias exhaled slowly. "I miss comfort sometimes, but I don't miss the man I was. I couldn't have built all this back then. What I have now, it means more." Jide nodded, eyes bright with inspiration. "I want to do what you're doing one day." "That's the goal," Elias said, smiling. Then came the fire. A market blaze erupted one afternoon, sending smoke and panic everywhere. Without thinking, Elias jumped into action, organizing volunteers, directing evacuations, calming chaos. His voice carried through the smoke like an anchor. When the fire finally settled, many stalls were damaged, but hardly any lives were lost. When Mama Ruth reached him, she looked at the scene, then at him. "Do you see what leadership looks like now?" she asked quietly. "This is why your journey mattered." Elias felt the truth of her words. Everything, the loss, the humiliation, the survival, had been shaping him for moments like this. The story spread fast. Philanthropists, NGOs, even local officials came forward, wanting to partner. But Elias moved wisely. Having once trusted the wrong people, he now protected the integrity of the mission with care. He filtered offers, choosing only what aligned with dignity and long-term growth. In private moments, he sometimes replayed his downfall in his mind, not as a wound, but as a classroom. He remembered the false friends, the failed deals, the pride that once blinded him. Now he stood rooted, grounded by reality and shaped by compassion. One evening, he found a boy, Tomi, sitting alone, drenched by rain. Elias sat beside him, offered food, and said no more than, "You're safe here." A single moment, but meaningful enough to plant a seed of hope. As the years passed, the little initiatives blossomed. Former street kids became leaders. Small businesses became stable livelihoods. The community center became a hub of transformation. And Elias, he became a symbol, not of wealth lost, but of humanity regained. Mama Ruth, growing frailer, often reminded him, "You built something that money cannot buy. Something storms cannot destroy." He believed her. One night, the city buzzed with soft energy. People moved with hope, with rhythm, with resilience. Elias stood at the center, watching everything unfold. Mama Ruth came beside him once again. "Do you see it now?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered. "I see the lives changed. I see meaning. I see real wealth." "You have become the man you were meant to be," she said, smiling gently. "Not because of what you owned, but because of what you gave." Elias looked around him, children laughing, youths working, families rebuilding, and he felt peace, true, deep peace. He had fallen from a skyscraper of wealth into the trenches of survival. But the rise that followed wasn't about reclaiming riches. It was about discovering truth, empathy, and purpose.